John Quincy Adams made Henry Clay Secretary of State. That was the corrupt bargain. The corrupt bargain was, okay, Henry Clay, Speaker of the House of Representatives, supported John Quincy Adams' candidacy for president and may have been contributed greatly to John Quincy Adams being elected. In return for that, allegedly, John Quincy Adams made Henry Clay Secretary of State. And Jackson and his followers called this the corrupt bargain. And you recall, Jackson and his followers are going to spend the next 4 years of the John Quincy Adams administration attempting to undermine John Quincy Adams and to posture Jackson in a position of being elected in 1828, which he was. So Andrew Jackson is elected to the presidency in 1828. By the time Jackson is elected, his followers are beginning to call themselves the Democratic Republicans. The followers of John Quincy Adams are referring to themselves as the National Republicans. Central to the National Republicans is the idea of the American system. The national government promoting economic expansion, growth, a national bank, protective tariffs, etc. Central to the Jacksonian Democrats is the idea of individual liberty and the power of the common man. The small Jeffersonian unintrusive government, or a government that did not benefit some and not others. And increasingly, the Jacksonian Democrats will see certain parts of the American system as being privilege. The privilege of some to have the power of government promote things that would benefit them. Now, one of the biggest differences between the Jefferson or the Jacksonian Democrats and the Jacksonian Democrats and the National Republicans is over tariffs. Eventually, the Jacksonian Democrats, the Democrats in general, are going to see tariffs as something that benefits a small group of people, but hurts a significant group of people. And so tariffs become a big issue. And probably the most controversial tariff in American history is term 21, the tariff of abomination. Now, I would say this, that the Jacksonian era, and there's lots of things in the Jacksonian era to talk about. Sometimes that's called the Jacksonian era. Sometimes it is called the era of the common man. Sometimes it's called the rise of the common man. Sometimes it's called Jacksonian democracy. But, certainly one of the things that separates the Jacksonians and their supporters from the National Republicans, who eventually are going to call themselves the Whigs, is this issue of protective tariffs. The tariff of abominations was passed in 1828, actually in the John Quincy Adams administration, prior to Jackson ascending to the presidency, and it really raised tariffs high. The people that liked tariffs the least were the cotton growers of the South. So, the cotton growers of the South, the plantation owners of the South, the people who sold their products on a world market, didn't like tariffs because they saw tariffs as costing them more for manufactured products and impoverishing their customers in the world. And so they opposed it. And they resented that the national government could do something like this that would help some and hurt others. Now, in response to the tariff of abomination, John C. Calhoun, who had at one time been a nationalist, but had increasingly become a sectionalist, wrote something called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. The South Carolina Exposition and Protest was an explanation or a justification for a notion called nullification, which is term 22. Nullification was the idea that an individual state, if they deemed an action of Congress to be unconstitutional, could nullify that action of Congress in their state. So, if the Congress of the United States passed a law, like the tariff of abominations, and that tariff was deemed to be unconstitutional by a special convention that was called by a state, then what the notion of nullification, as articulated by John C. Calhoun, said was that that state could declare that law unconstitutional within their state. Now, the notion of nullification was based on the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions said that the Constitution was a mere compact among the states, and that because that was true, states were free to interpret the Constitution for themselves. And in interpreting it, they could declare actions of Congress to be unconstitutional. Now, there had already, by this time, by 1828, there had already been a precedent that the Supreme Court was the final determiner of the constitutionality of federal law. What was that precedent? What was the case? Right? So nullification would be in opposition to this case and this precedent. Anybody? Yes. Marbury versus Madison establishes the notion of judicial review. Judicial review means who gets to determine ultimately, Brooke, what's constitutional. Judicial review says, no, it's not the state legislatures or it's not a special convention of the states, but ultimately the final arbiter of whether any kind of action is constitutional is whom? What group? The Supreme Court. Right? Now, so already by 1828, by the time nullification is proposed, there's already a precedent that the Supreme Court has declared an act of Congress unconstitutional. But the advocates of nullification disagreed with that and suggested that a convention of delegates could declare the action of Congress to be unconstitutional. Now remember, this notion of nullification eventually results in a showdown where South Carolina nullifies the tariff of abomination in a subsequent tariff, and Jackson threatens to send force to South Carolina, and the force bill is passed, and a compromise tariff bill is passed, and eventually South Carolina backs down. Sort of. They nullify the force bill, and they accept the tariff compromise. But they never surrender the notion of nullification. And remember, ultimately, South Carolina is going to exercise that notion when they secede from the Union, in 1860. Okay, term 23 is the cult of domesticity. The cult of domesticity is actually connected to term 24, the Lowell system. Because one of the things that happens in the Jacksonian era, or the antebellum era, is called the market revolution. This was like really controversial 2 AP tests ago. 2 AP tests ago, they asked a question about the market revolution. Nobody kind of knew what they were talking about. But the market revolution is this time period between 1815 and 1860 when sort of transportation networks were expanding, firms were getting bigger, workers were going off working for wages, the Industrial Revolution was occurring, and sort of the modern economy that we know today was emerging. Now, one of the parts of that was industrialization, factories. Now, we just talked about factories when we talked about the Gilded Age, but the first factories are in, the aftermath of the War of 1812. And those factories required workers, right? Workers. Now, we'll go to term 24 first. The Lowell system, the AP loves the Lowell system. The Lowell system was kind of a system of labor for textile factories. In New England, which was the center of textile manufacturing, factory owners were looking for a workforce. And the workers they attracted to their factories were young, unmarried females, ages maybe 15 to 20. And what they would do is they would bring these basically farm girls into Lowell, Massachusetts and other towns